that are submitted by the HSE and the other departments to the independent monitoring group published at the very least. However, in respect of the work of the independent monitoring group, firstly, I mean, Des is right, it can't be said to be fully independent given that the bulk of the representatives on it are government and HSE. But even at that, it simply isn't providing that robust monitoring mechanism that is critically required. What the HSE and government departments are reporting through that group to the public is largely meaningless. It refers to stuff they're doing anyway, or that was, referring to stuff they were doing in 2003, or stuff they plan to do. So it's not a monitoring mechanism that's working. So we need to lobby for an independent monitoring group that has the resources and independence to do its work. We also are looking for a national directorate within the HSE for mental health, but at a minimum, even on an interim basis, we need at least one person who has lead responsibility, and including budgetary accountability for implementing a vision for change. Again, resourcing across areas in terms of funding, but also strong accountability measures are a critical priority at the moment in order to protect funding, especially given the fate of the development funding. There's every risk that even if new monies were provided, they would just be leaking into shoring up the most expensive parts of the service. And of course, again, coming back to information, we want the HSE to actually publish periodically real information on staff profiles and funding resources around the country. Yeah, this is just more of what we want, so obviously our priority area will be the area of promoting the idea of a legislative framework and the interdepartmental action plan. So I'm just going to hand back over to Colm to say that what the P&A can do to help. Colm will just say a few words about that. But I guess just in conclusion, I'll just say that 3 years, having worked in this since 2003, 3 years after the publication of A Vision for Change, I feel like crying. It was such a wonderful policy, and yet everything that has happened has betrayed the confidence of everyone who bought into that policy, who lobbied for it, and in particular the service providers and users who engaged with that. It was meant to bring around a huge transformation in the way not just service users were treated, but service providers too, a new respectful way of working, a new respectful way of providing a service, and a service that actually works. So, nevertheless, while crying, we will be campaigning vociferously and scaling up significantly. We have put a new team in place for the period of the next 2 years to work specifically on mental health. So we would absolutely be delighted if people wanted to contact us for information or to give us information. Essentially, I suppose the net result for us is that today we can categorically say that the rights of people using mental health services as a result of government inaction are routinely and persistently infringed. This is a human rights issue that we need to call as such. Amnesty uses the human rights framework as a campaigning tool, and it's not just about the rhetoric. Colm will talk to that a little bit as well. But I think the point needs to be made as well that so long as the services keep failing to essentially become recovery focused through lack of resources, no predictability about what's actually planned, they will continue to undermine public confidence in mental health and in mental health services. They will continue to perpetuate the stigma, and they will reduce people's willingness to seek help. But all of this then ultimately lets politicians off the hook, because there isn't that pressure put on. Whenever people in public do not see that services can and do work, then government is able to evade its responsibilities to provide adequate resources on the basis of, well, we don't know how existing funds are spent. It's this ridiculous vicious circle that has to stop. So anyway, on that, I'll pass you back to Colm for a few further words. Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona. As Fiona mentioned, it's difficult to follow on from Des this afternoon when what we're talking about in many ways we're giving you a lot of very dense information, frankly. But what we're trying to do is, first of all, make it very clear to you that human rights are very solid principles and there's very solid law behind them. And that if we use this framework effectively, we can appropriately advocate and force the kind of change that we want to see. If we look at the history of A Vision for Change, and thus far the failure of A Vision for Change to deliver real and meaningful reform in services, in how services are funded, and how they're made available, and how they respect the rights of those seeking to access the service, and indeed the rights of those who work within the services, we can see that policy in and of itself isn't enough. We need policy, we need pressure. International law in and of itself isn't enough. because of our particular system. We need law here in Ireland. So we've gone the way of policy. We've secured the policy. The policy is excellent. The implementation is woeful. As new priorities develop, as new crises emerge, as government reacts in a moment to the newest crisis, we're back to the Cinderella scenario, where mental health falls completely off the radar again. And I was particularly struck and, quite frankly, horrified by the image of a situation where Cinderella in a few years' time might look like she wasn't in a bad situation at all. I thought it was a fantastic analogy to use, and one that I think should fill us all with horror if we care in truth about mental health and about mental health services. The first time I ever made a speech in my life, I was 14, and it was on mental health. It was on the need to reform effectively mental health services, looking in particular at the need to deconstruct that Victorian model. I was talking specifically about St. Senans in Enniscorthy, near where I lived at the time. A very long time later, we're still talking about the need to do that. We had a policy which said that that should happen, and we've yet to implement it. Our expertise, our skill set, is in using international law to force the Irish government to implement domestic law that means that these rights are judiciable and enforceable through the Irish courts. And we know that that works. Fiona's already given us an example in the area of disability. We know that that works. Our other particular skill set is in mobilising people. And what we intend to do over the next 4 years is to make sure that if Cinderella's still there, people know she's there. They know the conditions that she's living in, that you're working in, that your patients are being treated in, and they're outraged by that, and that they demand change in that. As a trade union, you know how mobilisation and activism works. There are many, many areas within which we can share resources, energy, ideas, principles, tools. And human rights and a human rights approach is a key tool in your advocacy around patients' issues in particular, and the reform and appropriate and effective resourcing of services to guarantee accountability in how resources are applied, transparency to demonstrate that resources have been given, have been applied, and are being used, and not simply diverted off to shore up some administrative nightmare that's been created by somebody else. Services exist to guarantee the best possible outcome for those who access the services. As vocational professionals, you took on a role within your profession because you believed in the vocational aspect of that. You are focused on, I'm sure, delivering the best possible outcome for your patients, whilst at the same time appropriately and understandably being concerned about the conditions within which you have to work. Applying a human right lens to that, using the expertise that exists to challenge and to force our government to fulfil their obligations under international law, to make those obligations real in Ireland, and to force them to implement policy decisions that have already been made, is a key way forward. The first core value or principle, citizenship, a vision for change. The individual is at the centre of the mental health system. The human rights of individuals with mental health problems must be respected at all times. How could anybody disagree with that principle? It's a core human rights principle. What we have to do now is advance that forward. We need to overcome government hostility to human rights and make that principle a reality. And our government have signed up to these obligations. Our government have created these obligations in the international context. And what they have to do now is make them real in the Irish context. There are many ways in which we can work together to make that happen, and that's really what we're asking for today. So we want you to explicitly use the human rights framework. We want you to promote awareness that good mental health is firmly linked to respect for human rights, that the highest attainable standard of mental health is a human right, and that our government have obligations in that regard.